You're listening to Chesterton Radio, broadcasting from the little station on Commercial Street in Atchison, Kansas. Stories, ideas, wonder. And now, from the common room.
I want to start today by telling you a true story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's about my mother-in-law. She has dementia, and her memory, as you might imagine if you've ever walked this path with a loved one, is just this landscape that is constantly shifting under her feet.
Right. It's a very tough road.
It really is. The lived experience of that condition isn't just, forgetting where you put your keys. It is a profound unmooring. Some days are clearer than others, obviously, but a lot of the recent past, the context of where she is, sometimes even what year it is, it just slips away into this fog.
Yeah.
You watch someone you love struggling to hold on to the narrative of their own life, and it can be incredibly isolating, both for her and for the family.
I can imagine.
Well, recently, some family came to visit, and we were all sitting around the living room. Conversation was a bit strained, as it sometimes is when people aren't really sure how to bridge that cognitive gap.
Right. People get nervous.
Exactly. So someone had the idea to put on an old radio broadcast playing on Chesterton Radio. It was an audio drama adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's 1938 classic, Rebecca.
Oh, wow. Rebecca.
Yeah. Now, normally, following a complex linear narrative is really tough for her. We usually avoid things with convoluted plots because it just leads to frustration.
Sure, that makes sense.
But as the audio played, something incredible happened. She sat there completely entranced.
Really?
She wasn't getting agitated or asking who the characters were. She listened intently to the crackle of the old recording, the specific cadence of the actors' voices from that era, the swell of the dramatic orchestral music.
She was really taking it all in.
She was. And when it was over, she looked around the room, smiled this incredibly clear, bright, grounded smile, and said that the broadcast took her right back to her childhood.
Oh, that's beautiful.
She told us Rebecca had been one of her absolute favorite books growing up. It was this profound, beautiful moment where the fog just parted. And it got me thinking, and, well, it's a question I want to pose to you today. Why do certain stories stay with you for a lifetime?
That is a fascinating question.
Right. What is it about a familiar voice, a beloved book, or a specific piece of music that can act like a physical key unlocking rooms in our past that we thought were closed forever? That is the mission of this deep dive today.
I love that.
We are going to explore how familiar narratives unlock our memories and our identities, and we are going to use the ultimate story of a haunting past, that 1938 masterpiece, Rebecca, as our guide.
It's the perfect framework, and to really do it justice, we have a wonderfully eclectic stack of sources on the table today.
We really do.
To understand the mechanics of this, we are going to be looking at, well, first, in-depth literary analyses of Daphne du Maurier's novel. We'll be unpacking the Gothic subversions and the psychological architecture she built.
Which is brilliant.
Unbelievable. We are also pulling from historical archives of radio broadcasting. Specifically, we're going to dive deep into 6 different radio adaptations of Rebecca that have been preserved on Chesterton Radio, spanning all the way from 1938 to a much later BBC Saturday Night Theatre production.
I can't wait to talk about those.
They're amazing. Plus, we have film critiques dissecting Alfred Hitchcock's legendary 1940 Hollywood adaptation. And, perhaps most movingly, we're going to integrate a poignant academic study from the Journal of Adult Learning and Teaching.
The dementia study.
Yes. It explores the lived experience of people with dementia when they respond to the visceral, tactile experience of reading and listening to literature.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we are moving from a deeply personal anecdote about a memory unlocked by a story straight into what is arguably the most famous literary exploration of memory in the 20th century.
Absolutely.
You can't talk about Rebecca without talking about how it begins. It might be one of the greatest opening lines in English literature, and I know it's a bold claim, but hear me out.
I'm with you.
Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again.
It's iconic.
Wow.
And it's a line that completely reorients the reader the very moment they open the book. If you pick up a copy of Rebecca at a bookstore, just looking at the cover, you might expect a present tense, straightforward thriller, or maybe a romance.
Right.
But that single opening line immediately disrupts your expectation by saying, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." Du Maurier is establishing a few critical things right off the bat.
Like what?
First, the events have already happened. Second, the house, Manderley, is inaccessible in the waking world. You can only go there in a dream. And third, the narrator is looking backward. It frames the entire narrative not as a mystery waiting to be solved in the present, but as a nostalgic, circular trap of memory.
I always felt like that opening puts a ceiling on this story. You know from page 1 that you aren't reading to find out if they survive or if they get away. You know they survive, but you also know they're stuck.
Yeah, exactly. The structure of the novel enforces that feeling of being stuck. The ending is actually at the beginning. The narrator and her husband, Maxim, are beached in a hotel abroad. They are living this dreary, exiled, highly regimented existence.
Just reading old English newspapers.
Right, reading papers, making small talk, and remembering. Du Maurier forces you, the reader, into the narrator's psychological state of retrospection. The past is inescapable, so the entire 400-page book is not an unfolding action, it is an act of memory.
It's like a ghost story, where the ghost is just your own history. And to understand the mechanics of this ghost story, we really need to look at the cast of characters, because they are entirely defined by their relationship to the past.
They really are.
Let's start with our guide, the narrator herself.
The unnamed narrator.
Yes. This is one of the most brilliant narrative tricks Du Maurier pulls off, and honestly, I didn't even notice it the first time I read it.
A lot of people don't.
The narrator has no first name and no maiden name in the entire text. She is just a timid, naive, lower-class, paid companion to this awful, snobbish American woman, Mrs. Van Hopper, when the story begins in Monte Carlo.
The anonymity is crucial. She describes her own handwriting as unformed and childish. She lacks a solid identity. She's basically a blank space. And she remains completely nameless right up until the moment she marries Maxim and becomes Mrs. de Winter.
But wait, even then, she doesn't really get an identity, does she? Because Mrs. de Winter is already taken.
That's the tragedy of her character arc. Her entire identity is completely absorbed by her husband and, by extension, by the ghost of the first Mrs. de Winter. When she arrives at the estate, she is constantly reminded that she is the second Mrs. de Winter.
Oh, that scene with the phone call.
Yes. She intercepts a phone call where someone asks for Mrs. de Winter and she instinctively replies, "I'm afraid you have made a mistake. Mrs. de Winter has been dead for over a year." She doesn't even recognize her own title.
That is so sad. Okay, let's talk about the man who gives her that title. Maxim de Winter. I've always had a complicated reaction to him.
Understandably.
On the surface, he represents the traditional romantic hero, right? The aristocratic rescuer who sweeps her away from her terrible boss in Monte Carlo. But looking at the text, he's kind of awful to her.
He is. If we look closely at the language Du Maurier uses during his proposal, it strips away the romance entirely. Their marriage is deeply transactional.
Yeah, he doesn't get down on one knee or anything.
Not at all. He doesn't declare his undying love. When he proposes to the narrator, he literally says, "Instead of being companion to Mrs. Van Hopper, you become mine."
Wow, you become mine. That is chilling.
It's a shift in ownership. It's an acquisition.
Okay.
Maxim doesn't want a partner. He wants a palliative. He wants a blank slate. Someone who will not challenge him. Someone entirely opposite to his vibrant, defiant, and terrifying first wife.
He just wants a sponge.
Exactly. A sponge to absorb his trauma, not a woman to share his life.
Which brings us to the character who actively refuses to let that trauma go. The most terrifying character in the book, maybe in all of Gothic literature, Mrs. Danvers, the housekeeper.
She is the physical manifestation of the past refusing to die. Mrs. Danvers was the first Mrs. de Winter's lady's maid since Rebecca was a child. She is utterly obsessed with keeping Rebecca's memory alive to the point of pathology.
The bedroom shrine.
Yes. She preserves Rebecca's bedroom in the West Wing as a literal shrine. The clothes are still in the wardrobe, the brushes are on the vanity, the bed is turned down every night. She functions as an enforcer of the past, constantly undermining the new, nameless narrator.
Trying to make her feel inadequate.
Always. Trying to drive her out, or in one infamous scene, trying to drive her to suicide. All to protect the sanctity of the past.
And then, of course, there is the center of this entire twisted solar system, Rebecca herself, the unseen title character. She's dead before the first page. She never speaks a single word of dialogue in the present tense, and yet she completely dominates the physical and psychological space of the novel.
Everything is measured against her.
Everything. Her handwriting, which is described as bold and slashing, completely dwarfing the narrator's timid script. The way she threw parties, the way she managed the estate, her perfume, her clothes. Which brings me to the estate itself, Manderley.
Manderley is a character in its own right.
I was thinking about this while prepping for today, and here's a way I started to visualize it. Manderley isn't just a setting. Manderley is like the physical architecture of the human brain's memory center.
Oh, I like that.
On the outside, it's gorgeous. It's this sweeping, beautiful, aristocratic ideal of a country home. You approach it through these winding, blood-red rhododendrons. But inside, it's completely compartmentalized.
Full of locked rooms.
Yes. It's got a west wing that acts like a suppressed trauma you aren't allowed to talk about, overlooking the sea where the tragedy happened. The house is a living archive filled with the ghosts of the past that absolutely refuse to stay buried.
The literary analyses in our sources support that interpretation beautifully.
Yeah.
Anne Williams, in her work on Gothic structures, points out that the Gothic home is never just a house. It is always haunted by its own history, often a violent patriarchal history.
Right.
Manderley is instilled with the lingering presence of Rebecca. It transforms into a space where the boundaries between past and present are completely blurred. The narrator isn't just alienated from her husband, she is alienated from her own supposed home because the home is already occupied by memory. Every time she touches a piece of furniture or looks at a menu, she is interacting with a ghost.
So Manderley is a place where the past physically overwrites the present. You can't live in the now when the wallpaper is screaming about then.
Exactly.
You know, this idea of the brain acting as an archivist of spaces being overwritten by memory, it maps so cleanly onto the real-world science of why familiar stories allow our actual brains to travel back in time.
It really does.
Let's move from the fictional architecture of Manderley to the actual neuroscience, drawing on that academic study about dementia and reading that you mentioned earlier, because I think this explains exactly what happened with my mother-in-law in the living room.
It is a vital connection to make. The study we are looking at is a feasibility study by Gillian Claridge and Sally Rimkite, supported by Ryman Healthcare and published in the Proceedings of the Extensive Reading World Foundation.
Before we go any further, I just want to say we must emphasize unequivocally that we are making absolutely no medical claims here today.
Correct. None.
This study is an exploration of the lived experience of reading and listening for people who find reading challenging due to cognitive impairment. It's an inquiry into the effective emotional response to literature, not a medical treatment protocol or a cure.
Absolutely understood. But the human element of this study is just beautiful. There's a specific anecdote they share right at the beginning about a woman named Mary.
Right,
Mary had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and moved into a residential care facility. Her daughter had previously confided to a researcher saying, "She really can't read anymore. She can't remember anything about it, can she? So we sometimes give her children's books."
And I have to admit, I understand that daughter's logic. If you are watching someone fail to track a plot from chapter 1 to chapter 2, you assume the act of reading a novel is pointless. Why read if you can't retain the story?
It's a common assumption. But when the researcher visited Mary in the care facility, she found Mary happily sitting with a large print Mills and Boon romance novel on her bedside table.
A romance novel.
Yeah. The researcher, probably a bit surprised, asked, "Is that a good book?"
Yeah.
And Mary smiled and said, "Oh, yes, I like romance."
I have to be honest, I'm a little confused by this. If Mary can't remember the plot, what exactly is she getting out of reading a romance novel? How is she enjoying it?
That confusion is exactly what the researchers were trying to address, because it challenges our fundamental assumptions about why we read. We tend to think of reading as a means to an end, the end being the retention of information.
Right.
The researchers point to Louise Rosenblatt's transactional theory of reading response to explain this. Rosenblatt argues that reading exists on a continuum. At one far end, you have what she calls efferent reading. This comes from the Latin word effer, meaning to carry away.
Or carry away, okay.
This is reading to extract facts. Think of reading a washing machine manual, or a recipe, or a textbook for a test. Your goal is to get the information, carry it away, and apply it.
Yeah.
Everyone who reads the washing machine manual should walk away with the exact same facts about how to use the spin cycle.
Right. If I read the manual and you read the manual, there is no creative interpretation. We both just want clean clothes.
Exactly. But at the other end of the continuum is aesthetic reading. This is reading for pleasure, for the lived experience itself. In aesthetic reading, the process is the purpose. You aren't trying to extract facts to carry away. You are engaging with the rhythm of the words, the emotional resonance, the imagery, the feeling it gives you in that exact moment.
Oh, I see.
For someone with dementia like Mary, the efferent capability the short-term memory required to carry away the plot points might vanish. But the aesthetic experience, the feeling of being uplifted by a romantic turn of phrase, the comfort of the narrative rhythm, the emotional engagement of holding a book that remains intensely real and present, The process survives even when the product doesn't.
That completely flips how I look at reading. It's not about passing a quiz on Chapter 3. It's about how Chapter 3 makes you feel while your eyes are scanning the page.
Yes.
The study brings up an essay by J.R.R. Tolkien called Tree and Leaf to help explain this, and I found this fascinating. Tolkien argued that when an author describes a mountain in a book, the image that pops into the reader's head isn't just the author's mountain.
It can't be, because you've never seen the author's imagination.
Right. So the reader's brain creates a composite image built from every single mountain they have ever seen in their own life. If I read the word mountain, my brain grabs the Rockies from a road trip I took 10 years ago, mixed with a postcard of the Alps I saw yesterday, mixed with a drawing from a children's book. I am co-authoring the story using my own memories.
And that neurological process is exactly how reading acts as a trigger for deep memory retrieval. Michael Burke, another theorist mentioned in the study, takes this a step further. He calls this phenomenon the affective maelstrom.
The affective maelstrom. It sounds like a weather event inside your skull.
It's a very apt description of the neuroscience at play, actually. Burke suggests that reading literature stimulates a personally created input grounded in our unconscious remembrance of past events, past locations, and past loved ones. Let's look at the mechanics of this. When you read a rich, descriptive text, your brain isn't just processing language in a vacuum. You are exercising complex neural pathways. The visual cortex lights up to imagine the scene. The emotional centers trigger based on the tone of the words. The brain is continually awash with these processing activities.
So it's a full brain workout.
It is. The words act as a catalyst, plunging into the subconscious and pulling up deep-seated memories from this affective maelstrom. You aren't just simulating the story. You are simulating your own past to make sense of the story.
So when my mother-in-law was listening to Rebecca, the crackle of the audio and the suspenseful music was acting as a catalyst, diving into her own affective maelstrom and pulling up the feeling of being a teenager reading that book.
Yes, precisely.
The neural pathways associated with that feeling were still intact, even if the pathway to what she had for breakfast was compromised. In the study, they actually tested this theory in a really compelling way, didn't they?
They did.
They gathered a group of participants with dementia and read them different versions of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. They gave them a children's version, a version with simplified vocabulary and syntax sort of stripped down to the bare efferent facts of the plot, and finally, the original, unabridged Dickens text.
And the hypothesis going in, based on standard care practices, was that the participants would prefer the simplified version. The assumption was that simpler syntax would be easier to process, reducing cognitive load and frustration.
But they didn't. That was the twist. They actively rejected the simplified version. They felt it lost the voice of Dickens. They didn't like the children's version either. One participant actually called it, frankly, childish. They knew they were being condescended to.
They absolutely knew.
What they responded to, vividly, was the rich, complex, original language. When the researcher read the original text describing Scrooge as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, the reaction was incredible.
It's my favorite part of the study.
One of the participants with dementia immediately shot back, "Piss off, you old bastard."
Which is a brilliant, entirely appropriate aesthetic response to the character of Ebenezer Scrooge.
I laughed out loud when I read that. It sparked a whole conversation in the room. They started debating what the word covetous meant. The rich language, the unusual use of words, it stimulated their brains far more than the simplified, prosaic text ever could. It evoked memories, it triggered their own eloquence, it brought back a sense of identity and agency in that room.
It gave them themselves back.
So I want you, listening right now, to think about this in your own life. Think about how you experience a familiar, beloved story. When you pick up a book you loved 20 years ago or put on a movie you've seen 50 times, are you really doing it to remember the plot?
No, you already know how it ends.
Exactly. You aren't reading efferently. You are reading aesthetically. You are doing it because engaging with that story exercises a neural pathway that brings you back to who you were the first time you heard it. Are you remembering the story, or are you remembering yourself?
It is a profound realization about the intersection of narrative and memory. We use stories as external hard drives for our own emotional history. And if we take this understanding of how reading triggers deep, sometimes suppressed memories, and we apply it back to Daphne du Maurier, things get incredibly interesting.
Oh, this is the good stuff.
Because Rebecca itself, the novel that has triggered so many memories for millions of readers, was triggered by a very specific, very haunting set of memories in the author's own life.
Okay, this is where we peel back the curtain.
Right.
We established that Manderley is this physical architecture of memory built to house ghosts. Well, who was haunting Daphne du Maurier?
Rebecca is fundamentally a masterclass in the psychology of jealousy, and it was born directly from du Maurier's own experiences and insecurities. In 1937, she was stationed in Alexandria, Egypt. She was married to Major General Frederick Boy Browning, who was a highly decorated war hero.
Sounds glamorous on paper.
On paper, yes. But in reality, she was miserable.
Yeah.
She loathed the strict, formal military environment. She felt isolated. And worst of all, she was consumed by jealousy over her husband's former fiancée.
Enter the real-life Rebecca.
Her name was Jeanne Ricardo. She was a glamorous, beautiful, dark-haired socialite. Du Maurier had found letters from Jeanne to her husband, and much like the narrator in the novel discovering Rebecca's bold handwriting, du Maurier became obsessed with this woman from his past.
She just couldn't let it go.
No, she felt utterly inadequate compared to this glamorous phantom, this real-life insecurity, this obsessive comparison to a predecessor she had never even met, became the psychological engine for the unnamed narrator's obsession with Rebecca.
It's so tragic, too, because we know from the historical sources that Jeanne Ricardo later died by suicide during World War II, throwing herself under a train. So this real-life figure, who was largely an invention of du Maurier's jealous imagination, actually met a dark, premature end, much like the fictional Rebecca. But what always amazes me about artists, and du Maurier in particular, is how little they sometimes understand the magnitude of what they are creating in the moment.
You're too close to it.
Right. Du Maurier is sitting in Egypt, pouring all this toxic jealousy and isolation into a manuscript. And she writes a letter to her publisher, Victor Galance, and she is basically apologizing for the book.
It's unbelievable.
She tells him she tore up the first 15,000 words in disgust, calling it a literary miscarriage. She warns him that the book is a bit on the gloomy side and says she hopes it won't be an awful flop that loses them a lot of money. I just don't understand that level of authorial blindness. How do you write one of the greatest Gothic thrillers of the 20th century and think you've written a flop?
It highlights how the writing process itself was a way of working through her own affective maelstrom. When you are that close to the emotional core of a story, when you are basically bleeding your own insecurities onto the page, it is very difficult to have objective distance on the plot.
She was just venting.
Exactly. She thought she was writing a moody little psychological piece about her own bad mood in Egypt, not a genre-defining masterpiece that would sell 2.8 million copies in its first few decades. And if we look at the Rebecca Notebook, which was published decades later and contains her original outlines and early drafts, we can see how the story evolved. The ghosts weren't fully formed at the beginning.
I read about this in the notes, and it's wild how different it almost was.
In her early drafts, the brooding husband Maxim was named Henry, a much less imposing, less romantic, less aristocratic name.
Henry sounds like an accountant, not a Gothic anti-hero.
Furthermore, Rebecca's sailboat, which becomes the instrument of her demise, was originally named Gypsy, implying a free spirit. Du Maurier later changed it to the much more ominous, ghostly Je reviens, which is French for I return.
I return. I mean, that is perfectly chilling. It's literally the thesis of the book painted on the side of a boat. You cannot escape the past. It will always wash back up on the shore. And the ending was completely different in the draft, right?
Yeah, evolution of the ending is the most telling part. Originally, there was no catastrophic fire at Manderley. Henry, the original Maxim, was simply injured in a car crash.
A fender bender.
A mundane tragedy. The evolution of the draft shows du Maurier leaning into the Gothic, realizing that the past cannot just be neatly resolved with a modern mechanical accident. The past has to be purged. It has to be burned to the ground. The Gothic demands a larger sacrifice.
Let's talk about the romance aspect of this, because I really want to push back on how the book is often categorized. When it came out, it was marketed as an exquisite love story. It won the National Book Award in the U.S. for Favorite Novel of 1938. People devoured it as a romance.
They certainly did.
But when you really look at the mechanics of the plot, it is incredibly subversive. This is not a fairy tale where Cinderella marries the prince and they live happily ever after. It is dark.
Modern literary critics, including Oberlamport Pons, have done excellent work on this. They classify Rebecca not as a traditional romance, but as a deliberate subversion of the Bluebeard myth.
Okay, wait, remind me how the original Bluebeard story goes. That's the fairy tale with the locked room, right?
It is. It's the classic French folktale of a wealthy, powerful, frightening man who marries a younger, naive woman. He brings her to his castle, gives her the keys to every room, but strictly forbids her to enter one specific room. When he leaves on a journey, her curiosity gets the better of her. She opens the door and discovers the murdered bodies of his previous wives hanging on the walls.
Right. And the moral of that story has always been a rather grim warning to women. Don't snoop. Don't let your curiosity get the better of you, or you'll uncover things that will destroy you.
Yes, in the traditional fairy tale, the woman's curiosity is framed as a dangerous flaw, and she is nearly punished with death for uncovering the man's secret.
But du Maurier takes that framework and completely flips it upside down. Because in Rebecca, the narrator is desperate to know the secret of the first wife. She is snooping constantly. And when she finally gets Maxim to confess when the boat is discovered, and he admits that he didn't just lose Rebecca at sea, but he actively shot her and sank her body in the boat, the narrator isn't horrified.
Not at all.
I remember reading this and thinking, run, get out of the house, he's a murderer. But she doesn't try to run away. She is thrilled.
Thrilled and relieved. Because what Maxim says isn't just, I killed her. The crucial part of his confession is, I hated her. And for the narrator, wrapped in her suffocating jealousy, that is the ultimate victory. The discovery of his crime doesn't repel her. It liberates her. She realizes he never loved Rebecca. The phantom competitor is vanquished. And in that moment, the power dynamic of the marriage completely shifts.
Hold on, I'm just realizing the horrific implication of this. She becomes complicit.
She absolutely does.
That's the darkest, most fascinating part of the book. In the Bluebeard tale, the wife is a victim of the husband's violent past. In Rebecca, the narrator becomes the active protector of the husband's violent past. Because she knows his secret and because she chooses to hide it, she gains total power over him.
Yes, literary analysis notes that Maxim becomes almost infantilized at the end. After the confession, he loses all his brooding, aristocratic power. He stares at her like a puzzled child.
Like a puzzled child.
She is no longer the timid companion with unformed handwriting. She's the guardian of the secret. She has dismantled his unassailable authority.
It is a radical subversion of patriarchal power wrapped up in the guise of a Gothic romance. The woman who is afraid of the house ends up being the only one who can navigate the psychological wreckage of the man who owns it. She domesticates a murderer.
Precisely.
Because so much of this story relies on what is unsaid, what is internal, what is locked away in the mind, it makes Rebecca the absolute perfect medium for audio drama. The visual absence of the ghost is the core of the story. You know, there's a comment from a listener on the Chesterton Radio YouTube channel that perfectly captures this phenomenon. They were listening to one of the old Rebecca broadcasts and they left a comment saying, "The pictures are so much better on the radio."
I love that quote. That is a profound insight into the specific mechanics of audio drama. When we watch a film, all the visual information is passively provided for us. We see the exact size of the room, the color of the dress, the specific expression on the actor's face. The director makes all the visual choices.
You just sit back and take it in.
Right. But radio demands active participation from the listener's imagination. You hear a creaking door, the howl of wind, a hesitant footstep, and your brain has to construct the entire scene. Your mind becomes the theater.
It's exactly like Tolkien's Mountain that we discussed earlier. When you listen to a radio play of Rebecca, your brain builds Manderley out of every spooky grand house you've ever seen or imagined in your life. Your brain casts the characters based on the timbre of the voices. Radio asks you to co-create the experience.
It makes it incredibly personal.
And because Rebecca is fundamentally a story about an invisible ghost, a woman who is never seen but is felt everywhere, in the rustle of a curtain or the scent of a flower audio is arguably the most effective, purest way to experience that haunting.
And we have an incredible opportunity to examine how different artists approach this invisible haunting, because Chesterton Radio has preserved 6 distinct radio adaptations of Rebecca in their archives. Comparing them shows us how the constraints and possibilities of radio force different interpretations of the text.
So where do we start?
Let's start with the very first one, December 9th, 1938. This was broadcast on the Campbell Playhouse, which was a sponsored continuation of the Mercury Theater on the air.
Directed by and starring Orson Welles.
Directed by, starring, and largely shaped by Welles. This aired just months after the book was published. Welles played Maxim de Winter, and Margaret Sullivan played the second Mrs. de Winter. What is constantly astonishing to remember is that Welles was only 23 years old at the time of this broadcast.
That blows my mind. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. He's 23 years old. He just terrified the entire nation a month prior with his War of the Worlds broadcast. He's the wonderkind of American media. And here he is playing this 42-year-old, brooding, haunted, aristocratic widower. How does a 23-year-old pull that off on radio?
He pulls it off through sheer vocal mechanics. Radio allows for a deception of age that film does not. Wells had this incredibly resonant baritone voice. He used a technique called close miking, getting intimately close to the microphone, which amplifies the bass frequencies in the voice.
Giving him that boom.
Exactly. It creates a sound that is both booming and claustrophobically intimate. He sounds like a man carrying the physical weight of a decade of dark secrets.
It's a brilliant performance.
The adaptation was written by Howard E. Koch, with a beautiful, swelling original score by Bernard Herrmann, who, incidentally, would later score Hitchcock films, though not Hitchcock's Rebecca. And because this broadcast happened before Hollywood got its hands on the property, it is fiercely faithful to the book. Wells retains the confession. Maxim deliberately murders Rebecca.
And the end of that broadcast is just an incredible piece of radio history and showmanship. After the play ends, they have a live interview with Daphne du Maurier, patching her in from London via shortwave radio. The static is thick, the delay is noticeable. Wells asks her, is there anywhere in England a house or an estate like Manderley?
And she mischievously gives him walking directions from Paddington Station, basically describing how to find Menabilly, the Cornish estate she loved and leased.
Right. And then Margaret Sullivan asks the burning question that every reader had, what is the name of the heroine? Du Maurier pretends not to hear through the static. She hangs up. And then Sullivan reads this scripted cryptogram supposedly delivered by carrier pigeon, which is just peak 1930s radio publicity.
Oh, it's so theatrical.
She says, inter-office memo from Daphne du Maurier to Margaret Sullivan. The name of the heroine of Rebecca is Mrs. Max de Winter. It was brilliant showmanship, preserving the anonymity of the character and the mystery of the book.
Moving forward through the Chesterton Radio archives, we see how different formats demanded different approaches to the text. Take the Screen Guild Theater versions. They did 2 half-hour adaptations, one in 1943 with Joan Fontaine and Bryna Hearn, and another in 1948 with Loretta Young and John Lund.
Okay, I have to ask about the pacing here. You're compressing a 400-page, slow-burn psychological Gothic novel into 30 minutes minus commercial breaks. That has to fundamentally change the story.
It changes it from a psychological thriller into a breathless melodrama. The pacing becomes frantic. You rush from the proposal in Monte Carlo to the arrival at Manderley to the discovery of the boat to the fire, almost without taking a breath.
You lose the mood.
Completely. What you lose in the half-hour format is the quiet paranoia, the slow, creeping dread of the rhododendrons, the oppressive silence of the house. You lose the effective maelstrom of the environment.
It's all plot, no atmosphere. But then you have the hour-long adaptations, which give the story room to breathe. We have a 1946 version from the Cresta Blanca Hollywood Players.
Yes, featuring Joan Fontaine, reprising her role from the film, but this time acting opposite Joseph Cotten as Maxim.
This one is fascinating because Joseph Cotten brings such a different energy. He doesn't have the booming authority of Orson Welles. He sounds a bit more frayed, a bit more modern. And Fontaine, by 1946, has really perfected that breathless, terrified stutter she used for the narrator.
And we can contrast that with the hour-long adaptations on the Lux Radio Theater in 1941 and 1950. The 1941 broadcast featured Ronald Colman and Ida Lupino, while the 1950 version brought Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh to the microphones.
Olivier playing Maxim again, just like he did in the movie. But Vivien Leigh playing the narrator is the real hook here, because if you know the Hollywood lore, Vivien Leigh desperately wanted that role in the Hitchcock film to star opposite her husband, Olivier, but she was deemed too forceful, too distinctly confident to play the timid mouse.
Exactly. She didn't get the part.
Listening to Olivier on radio is a study in contrasts compared to Orson Welles. Where Welles is booming and robust, Olivier brings this refined, brittle, aristocratic brooding. He sounds constantly annoyed, constantly on the verge of snapping. He brings a fragility to Maxim.
Finally, we must mention a later production preserved in the archives from the BBC Saturday Night Theatre, featuring Richard Pascoe as Maxim and Flora Robson as a truly chilling Mrs. Danvers.
She was terrifying.
The transcripts from this broadcast really highlight the raw intensity that audio allows, especially during the confession scene. Pascoe's delivery of Maxim's confession strips away all the aristocratic veneer. He says, "You thought I loved Rebecca. You think I killed her loving her. I hated her. She was vicious, rotten through and through, but she was clever. Oh my God, she was clever."
Vicious, rotten through and through. When you hear that isolated in your headphones, without any visual distraction, without seeing a handsome actor's face, the sheer venom of the words just takes over your imagination. But as we know, the story didn't just stay in the invisible theater of the mind. It made the leap to the literal theater, to the highly visible, highly scrutinized silver screen.
It did.
Which begs the question, how on earth do you translate a story about an invisible ghost and internal paranoia into a purely visual medium like Hollywood film?
The answer is, with immense difficulty and incredible conflict. The 1940 film adaptation of Rebecca is a landmark in cinema history. It was Alfred Hitchcock's American directorial debut. He was brought over from England by the mega producer David O. Selznick, who was fresh off the monumental record-breaking success of Gone with the Wind.
Talk about an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. These two men were fundamentally mismatched in their approach to filmmaking.
Completely. Selznick approached filmmaking as what he called picturization. He revered literary classics. He believed a film should be a lavish, literal translation of the book, word for word, scene for scene, if possible.
Very traditional.
Yes. He wanted a faithful adaptation that catered heavily to a female audience, focusing on the romance, the dresses, the grand sets, what he termed the little feminine things.
Hitchcock, on the other hand, was notoriously impatient with literal translation. He famously didn't care about the plausibility of the plot. He cared about the emotional effect on the audience. He wanted to build psychological tension, to focus on surface realism, and to craft a modern, disquieting thriller. He wanted to use the camera to tell the story, not the dialogue.
Exactly.
So Hitchcock wanted to make a Hitchcock movie, and Selznick wanted to make a Selznick movie. And when you watch the 1940 film, you can see the push and pull in every single frame. Selznick gives us these sweeping, opulent sets, the grand sweeping staircases, the velvet costumes. It looks like a fairy tale.
But Hitchcock uses his camera to constantly undermine that grandeur. He shoots Joan Fontaine dwarfed by massive, heavy oak doors. He shoots her shrinking into oversized plush sofas, making her look physically tiny.
It's so unsettling to watch.
The critic Alison Light brilliantly compared the visual style to Alice in Wonderland wandering into Bluebeard's castle. Fontaine looks like a terrified child trapped in a museum that is actively trying to crush her.
The visual tension is masterful, but the greatest conflict didn't come from the stylistic clash between the director and the producer. It came from an external force.
The Hollywood censors.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
At the time, Hollywood operated under the Hays Code, which was a strict, industry-enforced set of moral guidelines for motion pictures. One of the absolute unbreakable rules of the Hays Code was that a murderer could not go unpunished on screen. Crime must not pay.
Right.
If you commit a murder in a movie, you must be arrested, or you must die before the credits roll.
Which is a massive structural problem if you are adapting Rebecca, because the entire point of the climax, the entire reason the narrator gains power, is that Maxim deliberately murdered his wife, covered it up, and gets away with it completely scot-free, and the narrator helps him do it.
Exactly. The censors looked at the script and said, absolutely not. So to get the film past the Hays office and into theaters, Selznick and Hitchcock had to make a fundamental catastrophic change to the plot.
Wait, so they just changed the ending?
Yes. In the film, Maxim's deliberate murder of Rebecca is changed into a tragic accident. They were arguing in the boathouse. Rebecca trips, falls, hits her head on a heavy piece of ship's tackle, and dies. Maxim only hides the body out of panic that he might be falsely blamed.
I've always struggled with this part because on the surface, if you haven't read the book, making it an accident makes Maxim a more sympathetic character, right?
Yeah.
He's not a cold-blooded killer. He's just a guy who panicked. Why do the literary critics get so upset about this change? Doesn't it make him a better person?
It makes him a morally acceptable person according to 1940s standards, but it utterly destroys the feminist subversion that Du Maurier built. Let's connect the dots back to the Bluebeard subversion we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
In the novel, the narrator gains power, precisely because Maxim is a cold-blooded killer who is broken by the weight of his own actions. He says, I'm glad I killed her. He crosses a moral event horizon. And because he's broken, she has to step up. She holds his life, his freedom in her hands. But in the movie, by making it an accident, Maxim is softened. He is infantilized in the wrong way. He's just a poor, misunderstood gentleman who made a bad decision under pressure. It protects Laurence Olivier's image as a dashing romantic lead. But more importantly, because he isn't a murderer, the power dynamic of the marriage never actually shifts to the narrator.
Oh, I see it now. Because he didn't do anything malicious, he doesn't need her protection in the same way.
Precisely. In the film, as soon as the truth comes out and the investigation starts, the men completely take over the plot. Maxim and his lawyer go up to London to figure things out, to confront the doctor, to solve the mystery, and Joan Fontaine, the supposed heroine of the story, is literally left behind in Manderley, wringing her hands and waiting for a phone call.
Wow. It completely strips her of her agency. It restores the traditional patriarchal order that du Maurier had worked so carefully to dismantle in the book. The men solve the problem, and the woman waits at home. And this heavy-handed moral correction by the censors extends to the ending, too, specifically regarding the fate of Mrs. Danvers.
In the novel, when Manderley burns, it is heavily implied that Mrs. Danvers sets the fire. But she disappears. She packs her things and escapes into the night. She remains an unruly, unconquered force.
He just walks away.
Right. But in the 1940 film, Hitchcock and Selznick go to full Grand Guignol theatrical horror. They trap Mrs. Danvers inside the burning house. She is shown in Rebecca's bedroom, surrounded by flames, the ceiling collapsing on her. She burns with the house.
It's the classic trope of punishing the madwoman in the attic. Because the Hays Code wouldn't let them punish Maxim for murder, they redirect all the cosmic moral punishment onto the queer-coded, obsessive, non-conforming female antagonist. The film annihilates the unruly woman, burning her at the stake, whereas the book lets her walk away.
It's a fascinating study in how the medium and the moral policing of that medium changes the fundamental message of a story.
It really is. Yet, despite this censorship, despite the massive structural changes, the film won Best Picture. And the story itself across the book, the radio plays, the movies, the stage adaptations, has remained immortal. Which brings us to our final question today. Why has Rebecca survived for nearly 90 years?
It is a remarkable feat of longevity. The novel has never gone out of print since it was published in 1938. It has never faded from the cultural conversation.
I actually have a piece of historical trivia that proves just how deeply embedded this book was in the global consciousness, even just a few years after it was published. During World War II, the German military intelligence, the Abwehr, actually used a copy of the Victor Gallant's edition of Rebecca as a code book.
Really?
Yeah. Rommel's spies in North Africa used the pages and lines of the novel to encrypt messages about British troop movements. Why? Because the book was so incredibly ubiquitous, so common, that a spy could carry it in his luggage without arousing any suspicion whatsoever. Every soldier, every civilian was reading it. It was everywhere. It even traveled to Munich in the suitcase of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain.
That is an incredible testament to its ubiquity as a physical object. But as to why the story itself survives in our collective memory, if we synthesize all the sources and analyses we've discussed today, the answer lies in its refusal to be boxed into a single genre.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you want a terrifying gothic thriller, it delivers haunted mansions, stormy nights, and creeping dread. If you want a post-romantic coming-of-age story, it offers a young, nameless woman slowly finding her identity. If you want a subverted fairy tale, it provides a Bluebeard who is ultimately conquered and domesticated by his bride. If you want a sociological study of queer subtext and the stifling nature of heteronormative marriage, Mrs. Danvers' obsessive devotion to Rebecca provides an incredibly rich text for analysis.
It's a chameleon. You see what you want to see in it.
It is. But on the deepest, most universal level, beneath the genres, Rebecca survives because it is a story about the fundamental human inability to let go of the past. Every single major character in the novel is trapped by memory.
Every single one.
Maxim is trapped by his trauma and his guilt. Danvers is trapped by her fanatical devotion to a dead woman. The narrator is trapped by her agonizing insecurity over a predecessor she can never defeat. The novel speaks to that primal fear we all have, deep in our own affective maelstroms, that we are not enough, and that the ghosts of the past are more powerful, more vibrant than our present reality.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? I think it means that we are all in some way wandering the halls of our own Manderleys. We all have locked rooms in our minds. We are all haunted by versions of ourselves or versions of other people that no longer exist. Rebecca gives us a language, a physical architecture for that haunting, which brings me quietly back to the beginning of our deep dive today.
Back to living room.
Yeah. To a historian, those 6 old versions of Rebecca sitting in the Chesterton Radio archives might just look like fascinating audio artifacts. They are records of Orson Welles' brilliant youth, or Joan Fontaine's terrified stutter, or the moral constraints of 1940s Hollywood broadcasting. But for my mother-in-law, for one listener with dementia, sitting in a quiet living room, pressing play wasn't about analyzing the plot.
No, of course not.
It wasn't about dissecting the Bluebeard subtext or debating the Hays Code. It was a pure aesthetic experience. The crackle of the audio, the rhythm of the dialogue, the swelling of the dramatic music, it bypassed the damaged, effort parts of her memory. It acted as a catalyst, diving into her affective maelstrom and opened a door directly to a world she remembered. For an hour, listening to a story about a ghost, she got to feel completely, wonderfully like herself again. The fog lifted because the story remembered her.
And that is the ultimate enduring power of narrative. Just as the unnamed narrator of the novel could never truly leave Manderley behind, our brains are beautifully, inextricably hardwired to never truly leave the stories that shaped us. We carry our libraries, our ghosts within us.
So as we close the heavy oak doors on Manderley today, I want to leave you with this question to mull over. What book, movie, radio program, or piece of music immediately takes you back to another time in your life? Chesterton Radio Stories, Ideas Wonder.